Hello, everyone. This is the Eddie Network Podcast, and I'm your host, Ed Breniger. My guest today is Guido Palazzo. Guido is a co-author of a new book called The Dark Pattern, and I recommend that book to you. We're going to talk about what he sees as the scandals that have taken place in a lot of various corporations over the last several decades. And these will all be very familiar to you, and maybe even situations that you have had some kind of detrimental effect from the scandals that these corporations have had. So we're going to talk about that, and I think you'll find it very interesting. And I'm glad you're here. And here is my conversation with Guido Palazzo. Am I correct in pronouncing your name Guido Palazzo? Oh, good.
Yes,
Good. I'm always afraid of mispronouncing my guest's name, but I'm glad. Well, I'm glad you're here, and I'm looking forward to hearing what you have to say about businesses and scandals and this sort of thing. So, give us a kind of a kind of an overview of who you are and what you do, and how did you end up being the person you are today? Can you do that?
sure. So I'm a professor of business ethics at the University of Lausanne in Switzerland. I am trained as a philosopher and I studied business, and I always worked on this interface of business and philosophy, so better business and ethics. And in the early 2000s, focusing on problems of human rights and global supply chains, moving on to the link between organized crime and normal businesses, and ending up analyzing the dark side of business from the inside perspective of organizations. So I spent all my career looking at dysfunctional things in the world of organizations. And the book that I wrote with my co-author Ulrich Hoffrage, The Dark Pattern, is about how organizations can morally collapse from the inside, and how we can read what's going on there without falling for this oversimplistic reading of scandals that we normally have and apply, that if there's something bad happening, it must be some bad people who have done it. So what we argue in the book is, on the contrary, if you have large scale scandals with a lot of people participating, systematic forms of wrongdoing, it is good people doing it or average people doing it. Take the case of Wells Fargo, biggest American retail bank. Um, they committed fraud on their own customers. And we know today that more than 100,000 salespeople participated. So you need a lot of fantasy to assume that there would be 100,000 crooks in this company. You have to imagine an HR department that is just hiring criminals. That doesn't work as an explanation to understand what goes wrong at Wells Fargo, for instance.
So, is the system the problem?
I would say, in a broader sense, the context.
Mm-hmm.
Um, so the context makes people do what they do in a lot of cases. So we do engage in bad or good things very often, not because of who we are, but because of the situation we are in,
Yeah.
the pressure we face, the kind of sense making that we are confronted with, the behavior of others around us. So it's not inside us, the explanation is outside us. So we started to analyze corporate contexts. The system, if you want to understand this in a broader sense, the system is one of the driving forces, if you understand system as overarching belief systems, ideology. In the case of most of our scandals, this is the shareholder value maximization ideology that creates a kind of big societal context in which a lot of rule breaking makes sense as long as you maximize profit. So this is the system level element.
One of the things I've discovered is that people who join a company when they're young and they advance and they're now in their 40s and they realize that there's something missing and they're at a point of maybe career change. But what they discover is that they don't have really any values that are their own. They have absorbed the values of the company, and therefore they are in lockstep with whatever is going on, and they don't even know that that's what they're doing because they don't have any outside reference point for being able to say, well, this is not a good thing. I can't stay here any longer, that sort of thing. And so that's kind of what I see going on.
Yeah. When I teach my students, I often tell them about this research that has been done on people dying in hospices. So not people at old age, but people who are pulled out of their life because they have a terminal disease. And in the research on this, they are asked what they regret most about their life, because now that they have some time left to think about themselves and who they became until that point. And one of the key things most of them advance is that they wish they would have more often done what they think is the right thing to do and not what others expected them to do. But if you want to do more often what you think is the right thing to do, the first thing you need to engage in is you have to ask yourself, who am I? What are my values? Who do I want to be? Where do I want to go? I mean, it's not for nothing that in the ancient Greek times, there was this oracle in Delphi where people went to ask about their future. And there was this old lady giving random advice, and they had to interpret this. But the inscription of the temple is the most important element here. And the inscription was, know thyself. Ask yourself, not just once, but in regular sequence, who am I? What are my values? Am I on track? When you sit on an airplane and you take off, ask yourself, if I would crash now, the life that I left, that I have had until now, is it the life that I wanted? Am I relieved to go? Can I go like this? Or is there something missing? That thought experiment brings you to think about what you think are the gaps in your life and to rethink who you are and whether you are on track. But very few people do that. That's the sad story.
I totally agree with you. And one of the things that I identify is that there's a psychological problem there of not being able to distinguish the outside world to yourself, and that there's some kind of sameness to it, and that whatever is the outside world is me, or I am what the outside world is, and that it's kind of a Cartesian, I think, therefore I am, which I don't buy at all. I think we are, and then we think because we are. Our being precedes our thinking. But I see there's this psychological problem there of not being able to distinguish ourselves from the context we're in, and that we become absorbed in it, and therefore we. And I see this as a social media problem at its very core.
It's not social media certainly reinforces that, but it's something you find also typically in these scandals and in all kind of wrong behavior, that people have this feeling of not being in control of their own decisions.
Yes.
But when you ask managers who are engaged in illegal practices in a company that had a scandal, for instance, and afterwards they're asked, why did you do this? There are two answers that stick out. One is, I did this for the company. So I did not enrich myself, I did this for the company. And the second one is, I thought I had no choice. I thought I had no choice. And what that signals is, I am not in the driving seat. I'm not in control of things. And that is just what you described. We do what everyone is doing around us. We do what we are told to do. We blend in. So we lose this ability to make mindful decisions. We do mindless decisions. And when we do mindless decisions, we become blind very often for the ethical dimension of what we do. That's what I call ethical blindness. So you are engaging in routines that are harmful, that are illegal, that are immoral, and you might feel at the beginning a kind of dissonance, but the more often you engage in the same practice, the less you feel it. It goes away. It becomes a routine, a habit. You stop thinking. It's action without thinking. And then you get arrested and you are shocked by yourself. How could I ever do this? And you have no answer. Well, the answer is you never thought about who you are, what your limits are, and you never spoke up for yourself.
As you've been talking about this for some time, I presume. Is that correct?
Say it again.
You have been talking about these philosophical connection, the philosophical connection to business for a long time, and in particularly identifying this thing that you have described to us. This has been something you've been working on for a long time, I presume.
Well, I started when Enron exploded. So the bubble of the internet time. I continued with the big Siemens scandal that shook Europe, which was the first time that a non-American company was punished by American authorities, and which created this huge wave of new positions in compliance that European companies didn't have before. And since then, I have followed all these big scandals that emerged pretty much everywhere in the world, trying to figure out, is there something that happens again and again? Is there a pattern that repeats across all these different cases?
Have you had leaders of companies come to you and say, "I see what you're saying. How do we avoid this? How do we change the way we do things?"
Well, I've worked with companies and leadership teams around the world, very often companies that had a big scandal. So they were in a moment where they would consider ethics a leadership topic, because normally managers believe ethics is nothing I manage, right? So
Right.
ethics we have from our childhood, so we have values and we are good people. So what I observe in other companies would never happen here. So why would I manage ethics? Why would I invest in it, devote resources to it? But in the very moment where your company is caught in a big scandal, and these scandals can be super expensive. I mean, Volkswagen, we're talking about 30, 40 billion. Boeing, it's 60, 70, 80 billion, and it's ongoing. Um, you are shaken, you feel ashamed, you see your colleagues being arrested, and you ask yourself, how could this happen? And how can we avoid that this happens again? So very typically, and sadly so, when I'm invited by a company, it's after they paid a billion or two or three or five in fine, and not before.
So people don't change until they're in such a bad situation that they are forced to change. Is that the one of the kind of the principles that emerges from all this?
That's one option, right? So you realize that this is important when you don't have it. Like when you have COVID, you can't breathe. You understand that breathing is important. Normally you don't think about breathing. But there's also the other variation, which is rare but exists. It's companies who have very strong values, who try to live those values, and who proactively manage ethics from the top down. That exists as well. It's more typical in family-owned businesses, less so in shareholder value focused companies who have to perform miracles every 3 months, but exists also there from time to time.
So it's one thing to have a set of values that you endorse as a company. It's another thing of how those values get applied in the working of the company. So how do if someone who's in a business today and they have some level of responsibility, how do they translate the abstraction of some value like honesty or respect or some into something that's real and tangible and action oriented? How do they do that?
But the first mistake that companies normally, or managers in companies normally make, is that they don't talk about ethics. They are
Uh-huh.
morally mute. Why don't they do this? Well, because they are taught in business schools that their responsibility is profit maximization, that ethics is for their private life. So they very often, even implicitly, unconsciously feel if I talk about ethics, I'm perceived as a weak manager by my team. So I expose a dilemma or I talk about something I struggled with, and then they will think I'm weak, which is absurd because the opposite is the case. But managers never learned to talk about ethics. The first thing they have to do is to normalize talking about ethics in their team. Then what your people observe happening is much more important than what you say. You can preach values, but if they observe that in your decisions you deviate from those values or you act in a way contrary to those values, then they realize that these values are not real. They are not relevant for the company. Think about one typical thing. A lot of companies struggle with toxic but high performing managers. High performing in the short term, of course, because you destroy teams, you push them in burnout, whatever. But in the short run, it looks good. Your numbers are okay. You are one, maybe the best sales director of any region, but you are highly toxic. Now, under normal circumstances, when you have values that talk about we speak up, we treat each other with respect, and so on, when you have these values, you cannot accept this kind of behavior. But the typical thing that happens is they are tolerated in their wrongdoing, in their toxicity. Why? Well, because it's risky for a manager to fire someone who is performing, because who knows whether the next person is also performing, and your own bonus, your own evaluation depends on your team performing. So you don't fire the person. You let them continue, and you rationalize it. Well, he's a bit rough, but it's okay, and so you rationalize it. But what your team observes is, as long as you are performing, you can do whatever you want. So, and that is one of the elements we see in all these companies. Slowly over time, ambiguous rules, this is how we call this, ambiguous rules set in. It's not clear what the rules are. People start to interpret. Yes, we have this code of conduct, but I have observed my leader doing this or that. Right? And if people start to interpret the rules, they start to differentiate between the official rules and the informal rules. And what opens up is a gray zone. Right? In this gray zone, you can do certain things that are depending on your own interpretation. And when you are under pressure, of course, you interpret these things closer to the darker gray zones. And step by step, you slip over it into the black, illegal zone, but you don't see it happening because it normally happens in small steps. So what I always tell people is you must be consistent. You must stick to the rules. You must tell your team that the rules are important and you cannot tolerate rule breaking. Doesn't mean you have to fire or punish or whatever, but you have to send a signal that you don't want them to succeed at any price.
I see that. I've seen that a lot. And I see it as a management strategy to keep people from holding their managers accountable. And that as a result, there's this split between authority that the upper management has and the accountability. And so accountability is not upwardly focused. We're not going to hold our managers accountable. They have authority. They're going to hold the workers accountable. But the workers don't have any authority, really have any authority over how they work. And so there's this confusion and there's this crisis of identity, I mean, in the company. And I think that's why you end up with this cycle of constant new people coming in to run the company, and it doesn't work.
Absolutely. And so it's a combination of two things. You don't have the leaders on the top who lead by values, and you don't have the people bottom up who dare to speak up, to say that there's something wrong. Why don't they do this? Because they know in their context, this is a career terminating move. There's this famous email exchange between two Boeing engineers where one of them tells the others that the product they're developing, the 737 MAX, is dangerous and that they have to do something about this software problem that they were engaged in creating. And the answer of the other one, I guess it was his superior, is that before things change at Boeing, someone has to die. And what it signals is speaking up here is pretty much impossible. We cannot do this because when we do this, either nobody's listening or in the worst case, you get fired, harassed, yelled at, abused, and even legally pursued. So you don't do that. You don't speak up. So at the very top of the company, you never hear about any problems. At the bottom, they know about these problems, but the middle part blocks it. No one dares to speak up. A climate of fear is very typical in a corporation that has a scandal. At least that's what we find across all these stories. People have fear.
Is there? Oh, there's so many ways I want to come at this whole story, a whole topic. How long have we been in this kind of state of whatever you want to call it, this of disconnection from the ethical norms that should happen in a company? How far back in time do we go to when we began to see this occur and the changes were beginning to happen in corporations where this kind of mindset or this kind of approach to management began to happen? Can you give us an idea about that?
There are probably several phases. A decisive one is the move into shareholder thinking that comes with Milton Friedman in the 1980s. That is one element. But there's also this transition from a more family-oriented business to large bureaucratic structures that happens in the 50s, 60s, 40s even. There's this famous novel, The Death of a Salesman.
Yeah.
Right? And this story that is today read as a story of a dysfunctional family was never supposed to be a book on a dysfunctional family. It was supposed to be a criticism of companies starting to treat people just like commodities, kicking them out when they're old, replacing them, and not thinking anymore of the company as a kind of family. Although this family thinking had all kind of disadvantages, of course, the patriarchic system, but this transition to bureaucracy, and in the second step, the transition from bureaucracy to a profit maximizing bureaucracy, that is probably a key driver of what we see happening today. Because if you are a manager at the top of a company and you have to maximize something every 3 months, you have to deliver a success story that is growing and growing every 3 months, because you get kicked out if you don't do this. Then you will make sure that your success story continues. And in all the scandals, what I also observe is that the breaking point, so when people really get engaged in the dirty, unethical, illegal behavior, is when their success story is stuck, right? So Enron could no longer increase its share value. Their magic story of everything they touch upon turns into gold became incredible. They had to continue that story at any price. And you have to continue this, not just in a kind of fuzzy way, but every 3 months you have to deliver some new miracles. Under that pressure, a lot of leaders break and do not only do what it takes to achieve these goals, but pressure their teams to achieve those goals. And they don't want to know how they do it. Very often in these scandals, it's not the top people who get arrested. It's the people in the middle, because those at the top, they don't break the law. It's not the Wells Fargo CEO who commits fraud on the customers. It's the salesperson. But the salesperson does this under the pressure that starts from the top down of the company.
And in that sense, it really is a system that is leading them to do whatever anti-ethical or criminal behavior there is. It also seems to me that that what we have a failure of, and this is 40 years of being a leadership guy, is a failure of leadership at its very core. That we have been using the term leadership as a way of hiding what is really a type of denial of reality. You know, I can do anything I want to do because I'm in the position of authority, and therefore no one can actually do anything about it. And I can just move to the next business, the next corporation, and do the same thing. And my my PR person is more important than my financial advisor, because the PR is the way I continue to move from one place to the next, being seen as a great leader. I see this in politics as much as in business.
No, I agree. And you can see this when you look at the role model of leadership of the last decades, which is Jack Welch,
Yeah.
the manager of the century, how it was called. When he took over at GE, the first thing he did was he fired 25% of the workforce in the first 4 years in a ruthless, humiliating way. I mean, there's this story of the first meeting with his top leaders, a few hundred of them in the room, and he tells them, look to the left, look to the right. You won't see these people anymore in the future. And then he fires them. He introduces this Gauss curve where he differentiates people between high and low performers. The low performers he called dead wood, kicked them out. So the way humans are treated in organizations is horrible sometimes. And at the same time, we celebrate those leaders who do this. And then they grow their own team, like a member of his team was Harry Stonecipher, who then goes from GE to Boeing. And says, great idea. I fired 25% of the engineers in the first year, in the first 4 years. And doing the same humiliation with his leaders in the first meeting, asking the engineers or the salespeople of the Dreamliner to stand up and excuse themselves in front of everyone else because they were responsible for the bad performance of the company. So you humiliate people, you create a climate of fear, you randomly fire them because you can, and your shareholder value goes up. So people celebrate you as a great leader. we have the wrong role models in companies, and the business schools. I work in a business school. Are partially responsible. We celebrate this. We teach this. We teach charisma. We teach entrepreneurship, where there's this courageous, visionary white man normally who goes for it and who doesn't care about anything and smashes stuff on the way, as Mark Zuckerberg said once. We celebrate this. But this is exactly the kind of leadership that creates these cultures of fear and rule breaking and contempt for the rule of law and for society as such, that very often leads us into a huge mess.
I feel like what has happened is that the way organizations have developed has outstripped the rule of law to be able to manage the complexity that comes with that. And therefore, the corporations kind of dictate to the government as to how they're going to function. And
That's a part of what I call system, the ideology, because neoliberalism it's not just about profit maximization, it's also about this idea governments are bad. Regulation is making markets inefficient. So we should smash regulation. You see this right now happening with Dodge. We smash regulation because it liberates the markets. And when markets are liberated, they can do miracles. Right? As Ronald Reagan once said, the government is part of the problem, not of the solution. And now think about the consequences of that kind of policy. Boeing was self-certifying 97% of the Boeing 737 MAX, which then crashed, self-certifying. So the FAA, the regulator, didn't have enough manpower, enough resources to do the certification. So they let engineers from Boeing doing it on their own, which is, of course, a huge conflict of interest. And it led to the result that we have seen. The same with Volkswagen. It was Volkswagen who did the emission tests, and it was not the regulator. Theranos. No one was regulating these blood testing machines of Elizabeth Holmes. Nobody, because it was somehow falling in between two regulators, and no one was picking it up as a job. So very often in all these stories, dysfunctional regulation plays a key role, and that is based on this ideological belief that governments should be weak.
well, they were weak in one sense, but in another sense, they were the vehicle for all of this to happen. Because if the governments didn't allow it to happen, and I think they were allowing it to happen because there was such a cozy relationship between the corporations and governments that
Yes.
it's not, from my perspective, it's not one side or the other. It's the entire environment that existed, and to me, it is it's a form of extraction and exploitation of people as the owners of society. It is, and my grandparents were early investors in businesses. I mean, starting back in the 20s and 30s. They were an early investor in General Electric, in GE, and they had a lot of, and over the years, stock splits and stuff, they ended up with a lot of stock that got distributed out to my broad family, and I got some of that stock. And I remember sort of the wake up was about 10 years ago when GE stock dropped under $10 a share, and I could no longer use that stock as collateral on my mortgage. And that was, it didn't bother me in terms of my mortgage and that sort. It bothered me that this thing that my grandparents believed in, meaning investing in a company, investing in a country, investing to build something of value for the whole of the world, was basically being stripped of its wealth and stripped of its ability to do what we all kind of express a promise or saw this as a promise to the future. I'm thinking maybe of the American dream that no longer exists. And what is that? What is that dream? Well, you can get a job and you can support your family and you can grow and you can not become extraordinarily wealthy, but have enough wealth that you do not have to worry about your family and your children will have a future and that sort of thing. And that kind of ideal universal idea has been lost through this whole, um, say, 50 to 75 years.
Yeah, and the sad thing about this is that, I mean, if you look at what Jack Welch did, he did two things to increase the share value of GE in the short run: firing all these people, thus destroying knowledge, and buying back shares. Billions and billions invested in their own shares. But if you buy your shares, you cannot invest the same money in innovation,
That's right.
right? So the money is missing for innovation, for investments, for the future. But in the short run, your costs go brutally down, your share price goes up because there are fewer shares. It looks all great. And we know it is this thing, in combination with turning GE into a bank rather than a producer, that drove them into problems. And guess what? It remains a blueprint for companies until today, right? They all start to cut costs and buy their own shares. And Boeing is not the last of these stories.
So we've kind of diagnosed what the problem is. And you've done that with this book, and I can't wait to read the book. But you've diagnosed this is what has happened, and this is where we are. So what is it that we should be doing moving forward? I mean, can you project out 20 years or 50 years to say these are the kinds of changes that need to happen in order for us to rectify the problems that all of this stuff has brought to us?
I think you can give two answers. One is short run, one is long run. The short run answer for the people working in corporations today is that they have to engage in certain practices that protect them against this, what we call the dark pattern. So this pressure of the context to do the wrong thing, to avoid being the next company with a scandal, creating this context where you have moral conversations, pay attention to how you give incentives, do not create a climate of fear, all these things that you can do that influence the culture of the company so that people feel empowered to do the right thing, not the wrong thing. That's in the short run. In the long run, I think this system is wrong. We have to get rid of shareholder value maximization. We have to get into a world where organizations think about various stakeholders in the sense that they have to balance expectations. And there's not one to maximize, because maximization mathematically means you can do only one thing, right? You cannot maximize two things, only one. And if you maximize something, you do this at the expense of everything else. So it's not just shareholder value maximization that is bad. Also, when Amazon says we maximize customer satisfaction, it often comes at the price of the health of the workers in the warehouse, for instance. So
Understand that.
maximization is, as such, is a stupid idea because it does not create long-term viability of the organization. Balancing contradictory expectations, growing expectations from society, a society that is in deep trouble right now for various reasons: ecological crisis, crisis of democracy, young people's disorientation with new media, and so on. So balanced analysis of many interests, and that leads to long-term success, not short-term cost-cutting, buying back your shares, and not giving a damn about people in your organization.
Do you have hope for change?
Always. I mean, all these stories teach us something.
Yeah.
And I hope that the book, The Dark Pattern, makes a contribution to managers understanding that the way we have led organizations so far in the last decades is leading us nowhere. We need to change that. And everyone needs to be humble enough to understand that they could be the next big scandal, right? Because we have all the stereotype. We think, well, this is horrible what happened at Boeing, at Volkswagen, at Theranos, but I am not like them. I wouldn't do these things. But guess what? The people who did it also thought before they did it that they would never do these things. So we have to be humble about the impact of context of our own decisions, and we have to realize that we as leaders influence our teams in their behavior. So we might even, against our own intention, push our teams into legal problems. And reading The Dark Pattern, understanding the social psychology of context, will hopefully make a contribution to have a workplace with more dignity and more respect. That would already be a good starting point for the future.
You may not intend to be a bad actor, but your complicity creates that condition where you are. And I forget who said it, but there's someone that said this 50, 60 years ago. It said the only thing that keeps bad people from being bad people or good people being good people. It's not exactly the way it goes, but if they're silent and they do not act to do the right thing, then we end up with the opportunity. Uh, let me rephrase it this way. Um, I've in the last year and a half, I've moved into a city, back to my hometown, and I'm living in a neighborhood that is in transition, it's gentrifying, and I've watched over the last year drug gangs operating across the street and behind me, and they're wandering around my neighborhood, walking through my yard, and I'm watching what I'm calling an underground economy. It's an underground economy of drugs and prostitution and that sort of thing. And as I look at these people, and I'm not having any interaction with them, as I look at them, I realize that they have no place to fit into the larger economy of the world. And so these underground economies rise up because they have to in order for something to be able to service these people that the governments can't take care of. They're homeless, they're drug addled, they don't have any skills. All of this is present in the world right now where I live. And I realize that as I look at my community and I look at all the institutions that are here to support my community, that they don't have any answers for the people that surround my house. And that's one of the problems we have. There's this kind of this segmentation of the society where we can't really identify what's going on in the whole. We only can see what is happening to me in my little box of life that I have, and that we have to kind of figure out how to move beyond that and be able to see that these people here have they're just as valuable as Jack Welch, but not monetarily. They may have something to offer to the world, but there's no mechanism, there's no system for them to be able to find that and to find their life changing because they could.
When shareholder value ideology became the dominating thinking or reference point for politics in America, in the UK, and globally, it came with a promise. And the promise was that if we only concentrate on ourselves egoistically, the market will turn everything into welfare for everybody. So we lift the whole society to a higher level of welfare and happiness. And what you just described right now is, in a way, the legacy of that thinking, because we see
Absolutely.
it doesn't work. It doesn't work. It makes, if everyone thinks about him or herself alone, if we don't create an economy that thinks broader than just shareholder value, societies fall apart. And in the end, democracies fall apart. And that is, for me, one of the biggest risks that we are facing today. And all these drug problems that you describe, you can lead it back to just one single corporation, that is Purdue Pharma, right? All the people who died since then on fentanyl, on heroin, they all started at one point with OxyContin, a product that was sold with profit maximization intention with the help of McKinsey. And today we see the result. So when everyone thinks about themselves alone, there's no welfare for everyone. This is a fairy tale, and we have to wake up from that.
Well, what you're saying is that we're all connected together.
Exactly. And we have to think intersubjectively, interconnectedly, and not as egoistic, utilitarian, maximizing monads, right? The Ayn Rand story, it's a wrong story.
Yeah, and it has its following, but I know very few people who believe in that, but they will live that, and that
Mhm.
I think that's a different thing. So, my last question: um, what would you like to see happen because you've published this book? Do you want to see more speaking engagement? Or do you want, what is it that you would like to see as the impact of this book, say, over the next 2 or 3 years?
Well, I had a lot of speaking engagement before. That's why I wrote the book. I was asked by managers to write something about what I was telling them. So that's not my concern. My wish would be that students in business schools, managers in corporations, read the book and discuss among themselves and learn from it and compare what they see and what they decide and how they decide in their own organizational context. Um, Compare that to the stories that I share and ask themselves, are we on track not to fall victim to the dark pattern? That would be already something. If I could help people not to become criminals because they are on the slippery slope, but they stop early on because they read what I wrote, that would be nice.
Well, I wish you well.
Thank you.
I'm glad you've written this book, and it touches a lot of places that I've had interaction and interest over the years. So I thank you for that, and I wish all of you who have listened or watched today that you'll go buy his book, because I think what you need is some way to kind of grasp in some kind of solid way what is actually taking place. And you
Yes.
don't get that in the 15-second or the 1 minute long um, video clips that you will find on social media. You'll just hear an idea, and that's not enough. You need to think more deeply about these issues, because I see this as, I see that all of this began with how the First World War began, and the outcome of the First World War, which is the overthrow of all the family aristocracies and the takeover of the world by the government bureaucracies of the West. So that's, I go far. That's how far back I go to see what you're
Mm.
seeing. And but we're coming to the end of that because it's unsustainable.
Yep, it is.
Something will have to emerge, and it's really for us to decide what that is.
It might have worked in the past. It will not work in the future.
That's right. So thank you, Guido. I enjoyed having you here. I hope you've enjoyed our conversation. Guido Palazzo has done some great work, he and his co-author, on looking at corporate scandals and their effect upon the world and effect upon us. And the question is, what are we to do about this? Well, I think knowledge is a beginning point. I think just recognizing that these things have taken place and that we may have, by our silence, been complicit in some of this. I accept some of that. But the larger question is, how do we live our lives in an ethical way where we're not tacitly accepting exploitation of people through various large systems, whether it's a business system or a government system? These are questions that I think we all face. And I hope you will continue to watch the Eddie Network podcast, because these are the kind of questions I find all the time talking with my guests about. I thank you for watching. Please hit the like button and subscribe to the YouTube and the Substack versions of the podcast. And I look forward to seeing you again real soon here on the Eddie Network podcast. Bye-bye.